From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. In a world where it's generally acknowledged that taxes are already for the little people, quote unquote, and corruption is, I would say, a widely accepted open secret, how can government institutions hope to fight the almost entirely invisible kaiju of global financial crime in the art world? Good news. Matt, you and I looked into this. We know that the U.S. is taking a stab at it with some new proposed bills. Essentially stuff like the Bank Secretary Act, BSA, and AML, and something called the Combating the Financing of Terrorism laws. The BSA,
AML is anti-money laundering, by the way.
Yes, anti-money. Yes, thank you. Anti-money laundering. The BSA already requires people who deal with precious metals, stones, and jewels to report activities that seem sus to the authorities. Like, think of you buy diamonds and you're pretty sure someone's trying to sell you blood diamonds. You would report that, or they're stolen. You would report that. The idea here is to expand those reporting requirements to art dealers in the U.S. Some shady entity is like, hey, I want to sell this to you for $200 million. And you're like, wasn't that painting stolen? Well, I don't know where it came from. You know what I mean?
I know it's in my gallery right now.
So the idea is, and again, gallery owners and art buyers and collectors are not everybody is in on this. Not everybody. But now we have to look across the pond. We know the European Union Commission had issued an anti-money laundering directive in 2018 in June, which also expanded the coverage of regulation. So they started counting people trading in the world of art as obliged entities, meaning people who had to report suspicious activities. And they also had to report it if they were storing art in free ports, if the value of a transaction or a group of linked transactions equaled 10,000 euro or more.
Yes.
That's what they want to happen.
Well, and they're actually taking some of this stuff into effect. You can read about it right now. Some of the latest news coming out of the UK has to do exactly with this. And that number in particular, 10,000 euros or more, is so low compared to what the other regulators in other countries are trying to establish. Most of the others, like with the United States and a few other European countries, are setting that minimum as like, it has if it reaches this amount of money or more, then it has to be reported around $100,000 US. So this is like, most of the other countries are looking at transactions that are 10 times the amount that the European Union wants to look at.
Yeah, and like you said, this is something that's still in flux. In some parts of the world, we're in the early days of this kind of regulation. In other parts of the world, it's still kind of in the idea phase. You can read a pretty great summation of U.S. laws and various law review outfits. And we have to point out, of course, not everybody's on board. In the view of some art dealers, the legal changes in the U.S. and Europe would strip vendors of one of their big selling points, the ability to offer anonymity to clients, either on the buying or selling side. And this anonymity, the desire for anonymity, despite what surveillance states would have you assume, does not necessarily make somebody a criminal. You might just want to sell one thing, and you might be doing it because you actually need the money and you don't want people to know. Or you might be doing it because it's just one piece of a larger collection and you don't want to get bombarded by other people who want to buy other stuff in your collection. You know what I mean? Like, privacy is a currency all its own. So those parts aren't necessarily criminals. And in the years back in the day, the fine arts market was often seen as a playground for the wealthy. the indolent well-to-do, the socialites, and so on. There was no real drive on the part of the authorities to police it, to apply laws to it as strenuously as they would to something like banking, which they could also use some help regulating banking, but whatever. Only time will tell what happens to this practice, because for now, it's a Wild West. It's a gold mine, baby. Right now, with the appropriate connections, you can easily launder money through fine art. Your odds of getting away with it, again, for right now, are actually pretty good. If you get caught, at least a lot of the cases I've seen, if you get caught, you're probably getting caught due to something else you did. The actual gun running, the actual embezzlement, the trafficking or whatever. The art as a laundering mechanism only gets discovered later in the investigation. Like in Philly, where they busted the drug dealer and they were like, wow, this guy has great taste.
Man, this guy, yeah. Oh, that surprise when you open the storage unit and you're like, oh my God, there's 33 paintings in here that are all worth, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars.
Why can't this happen with like grimoires, books of the occult, obscure reference works, or comic books? I would be cleaning up. But
jeez, man. You can open my storage unit and you can just find all my son's clothes. All of them.
That'd be kind of creepy if I didn't know you.
What do you do with them? They're sentimental value,
Right. And kids grow so fast, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what we're talking about now, this money laundering problem, is all just the traditional old school hustle. We have to admit that the rise of new art, things like non-fungible tokens, NFTs, can also produce opportunities for money laundering in theory, and only time will tell what happens with all those nifty new technological toys.
Especially when you bring in the crypto techniques, right?
Yeah.
When you're talking about money laundering, like it's a whole new world there.
Yeah, yeah. Until people figure out who Nakamoto is, well, like we don't know. So for the more cynical folks in the crowd, I would say myself included, candidly, there's also the issue of corruption in the halls of power. A lot of people participating in these conspiracies also have influence in the world of business and politics. We are talking big fish, capital B, capital F. It can be plausibly difficult, or even at times dangerous, for regular authorities to make a fuss. It might even hurt re-election chances for some politicians, especially those that depend heavily on private campaign donations, which can come from those capital B, capital F, big fish.
Yeah, if you've got the money to, hide away in art at the extent that some of these players do, then you can imagine that a campaign donation isn't out of the question, especially if it's going to benefit you personally in some way.
Yeah, and art as an avenue for money laundering, really money laundering itself as a kind of art form, these aren't things that immediately impact the average person. So there's not a ton of on-the-ground momentum to change this dirty status quo. In fact, the majority of the stories about this in the media kind of take this wealthy folks are bad angle, which is honestly misleading. There are scads, get it, Georgia natives, of affluent folks who legitimately just dig art or a certain artist. It's either for their own personal enjoyment, maybe it's a social flex to talk about at the next fundraiser. And of course, there are people who rightly see this as a genuine, if at times, wobbly investment. Matt, as we're at the close of the show, I have to ask you, with this regulation, I know that we've both read up on this. Do you think it'll have teeth? Do you think it'll make a difference?
Well, I think back to that example we gave of the $450 something million that was spent on one painting. And that was done at an auction, a somewhat above board auction, right? That kind of transaction, I think it will be easy to enact regulations on. When it comes down to the private buying that we outlined up at the top, I think it's going to be extremely hard for any regulator in any country to get a firm grasp on those transactions.